The desert wind swept across Cedar Ridge, Arizona, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and fading sunlight. Deputy David Brennan, 42, lay flat on his stomach near the edge of a rocky cliff, the red sandstone scraping against his arms as he strained to hold on to a thick rescue rope. His uniform was torn and streaked with dirt, his breath heavy and uneven. The rope dug deep into his palms, burning his skin as he fought against gravity itself. Below him, dangling from the harness, was Bruno, his loyal German shepherd, his partner, his best friend. The dog's back legs swung helplessly in the air, claws scraping at the rock face, but his golden eyes stayed fixed on David. No barking, no panic, just trust. The kind of unspoken bond that didn't need words. David's throat tightened. He had already lost too much in his life to lose Bruno now. Not after losing Linda, his wife, to cancer 3 years ago. Not after his brother, Michael, had vanished without a trace 12 years earlier. He couldn't take another loss. "Hold on, Bruno. I've got you, buddy," David murmured, his voice shaking. The desert wind howled around them, carrying the faint rattle of pebbles falling into the canyon below. His arms trembled, muscles screaming with fatigue, but he refused to let go. Each pull of the rope was a battle against gravity, against time, and against the ghosts of his past that never stopped whispering. In one desperate surge, David shifted his weight back and heaved. The rope tightened, the sound of fibers straining echoed against the canyon walls, and finally, Bruno's front paws scraped the edge. With a final pull, David dragged the dog over the ledge and collapsed backward, both of them hitting the ground hard. Dust filled the air, but the moment Bruno's paws met solid ground, he pressed his head into David's chest, panting but alive. David wrapped his arm around the dog and let out a shaky breath. For a moment, there was only silence, broken only by the distant hum of the wind and the beating of his heart. He looked at the horizon, the sun melting into the desert, and thought about how close he'd come to losing the only companion he had left. Then his radio crackled to life. "Brennan, it's Sheriff Hayes," came the static-filled voice. "We found something near Patterson Trail. Might be tied to your brother, Michael." David froze, staring at the radio in disbelief. His pulse quickened, his throat went dry. After 12 long years, the past wasn't buried anymore. It was calling him back. The next morning, the sky over Cedar Ridge was a dull, heavy gray, unusual for Arizona, and fitting for the weight sitting on David Brennan's chest. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Michael's face, younger, full of energy, disappearing into the blur of 12 lost years. Now, suddenly, Sheriff Robert Hayes was telling him they had found something out by Patterson Trail, the same area where search teams had given up long ago. Driving the dusty patrol truck down the narrow, winding dirt road, David sat in silence while Bruno rode beside him in the passenger seat, his head resting on the dashboard. The K9 seemed to sense the shift, that this wasn't just another routine patrol. Patterson Trail had always been a dead end, a place the town quietly forgot. But the sheriff's voice on the radio had sounded serious, too serious to ignore. David's mind kept circling back to the day Michael vanished. There had been no warning signs, no note, just his truck found abandoned on a back road and a lifetime of silence ever since. They had fought a few days before, a stupid argument about money and responsibility. David had been harsh, unforgiving. Now, those last words were all he had left of his brother. That and regret. When David pulled up to the site, Sheriff Hayes and Deputy Wilson were already waiting behind the taped-off section near a patch of dry brush. David stepped out of the truck, boots crunching against the gravel, Bruno jumping down to follow closely at his side. Hayes didn't waste time. "We found a buried backpack," he said. It was partially exposed from recent erosion. Inside were papers, one with Michael's name, and this. The sheriff held out a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a small, worn key, and engraved on the side were the initials, JP. David's breath caught. "Jennifer Palmer," he said quietly, Michael's ex-wife. She had left town shortly after the disappearance, never to be seen again. No one had ever connected her to anything. Until now. David knelt near the evidence markers, staring at the dusty backpack now sealed in another clear bag. He remembered it from their hiking trips as kids, the torn strap, the faded army green color. It was his brother's, no doubt. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass around them, and for the first time in over a decade, David felt it again. That sick, twisting sensation in his gut. Something about this didn't feel like closure. Felt like a warning. David stayed crouched beside the evidence markers, eyes fixed on the old backpack. The dust clinging to its torn strap felt like a thin veil hiding 100 unspoken truths. For a moment, it was like the desert had time traveled, delivering something lost back into his hands. He reached out and touched the plastic bag, and a flicker of memory hit. Michael, 17, wearing that same backpack on a trail behind their house, laughing like the world would never change. "Are we sure the ID belongs to him?" David asked, his voice low. Sheriff Hayes nodded. "His name, his old license, and the key. Well, it's more than coincidence." David didn't respond. The initials JP, Jennifer Palmer. Her connection to Michael had always been complicated. They divorced quietly, then she vanished from town just weeks before Michael disappeared. No one had questioned it too deeply, but now, with her initials turning up in the dirt, everything felt different. Bruno suddenly let out a low growl and walked a few feet toward a cluster of rocks near the edge of the clearing. David followed, heart pounding. Nestled beneath a bush, half covered in dried leaves and dust, were small, smooth stones. They weren't natural. They had been arranged intentionally. And when David brushed the leaves away, his blood ran cold. The stones spelled a single name. Emily, his daughter's name. Emily Brennan, who lived in Phoenix, far from this canyon, far from everything that had ever happened here. Why would her name be here, in the middle of nowhere, near a decades-old disappearance? David stood frozen, jaw tight. It didn't make sense. Unless someone wanted to make sure he found it. Unless someone knew exactly what buttons to press. Deputy Wilson approached quietly, glancing at the stones. "You think someone put this here recently?" David didn't answer right away. He knelt beside the makeshift message again, staring hard at it. "If they did, they knew I'd come here. They wanted me to see this." He stood, brushing dust from his knees. "This isn't random. This is personal." The wind picked up around them again, whistling low between the rocks like a whisper. Something had changed. The discovery of Michael's backpack wasn't the end of a mystery. It was the beginning of something much darker. By the next morning, David was no closer to answers, only more questions. He sat at his kitchen table in Cedar Ridge, staring at the photo of Michael he kept in a drawer. In the picture, they were teenagers, arms over each other's shoulders, grinning like nothing in the world could ever go wrong. But something had. And now, Michael's name and his daughter's were tangled together in a place neither of them belonged. He needed to talk to someone who had lived through it, someone who might have seen what others missed. His mind turned to Mrs. Anderson, the elderly neighbor who had lived next door to the old Brennan house for over 40 years. She had always been sharp, observant, and polite in that southern way that meant she knew everyone's business, and kept most of it to herself. If anything strange had happened the night Michael disappeared, she would have noticed. Her house was the same as it had always been. Pale blue siding, a creaky porch swing, wind chimes made from old spoons. David knocked gently. A moment later, the door creaked open and Mrs. Anderson appeared. Smaller than he remembered, but with the same piercing eyes. "David Brennan," she said softly. "I wondered when you'd come back around." He didn't waste time. "Do you remember anything from the night Michael disappeared? Anything at all?" She stared at him for a long moment, then slowly opened the door wider. "Come in, dear. I think it's time I told you what I should have said a long time ago." Inside, the air smelled of cinnamon and old books. Bruno settled near the door, watching quietly. They sat in her kitchen, the ticking of an antique wall clock the only sound between them. "That night," she began, "I was sitting out on the porch. I saw Jennifer Palmer leave your family's house around midnight. She had a box in her hands. She looked upset. Real upset. She got into a car I didn't recognize and drove off fast. I didn't say anything back then because, well, it wasn't my place. David leaned forward, heart pounding. Why didn't you tell anyone? I didn't want to get her in trouble, and I wasn't sure what I saw. But now, if your daughter's name is showing up out there, something's not right. David nodded slowly, the weight of it all pressing down. Jennifer had always been a question mark. Now she was becoming a threat. And if she knew something, it was time to find her. By noon, David was back at the sheriff's office, sitting across from Sheriff Robert Hayes with a knot tightening in his chest. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and dust. David dropped a notepad onto the desk, his handwriting rushed, chaotic. Names, locations, years. We need to find Jennifer Palmer, he said flatly. Now. Hayes looked over the notes. We tried locating her years ago. She vanished. No known addresses. No job records. Nothing. David shook his head. Someone doesn't just vanish. Not like that. And not right after my brother disappears. I think she was involved. Or at the very least, she knows what happened that night. Hayes studied him. You think she left that message? The one with Emily's name? David nodded. She knew my daughter. And if that name was left as a warning, or a message, or a threat, she's the only one who makes sense. They ran a fresh search. Took hours. David paced the room while Deputy Wilson clicked away at the computer. Then finally, a hit. A medical form filed under an alias 2 years ago in Flagstaff, Arizona. The emergency contact listed was Jennifer Palmer. No address but a phone number. It was more than David had expected. He stood, grabbed his keys and looked at Hayes. I'll take Bruno. We leave now. The drive north to Flagstaff felt endless. The landscape shifted from red desert to high pine forest, but the weight in David's chest never lifted. Every mile closer brought more uncertainty. He hadn't seen Jennifer in over a decade. The last time had been in a courtroom during the divorce. She had barely looked at him. And now she might hold the key to everything, to Michael, to Emily, to the question that had haunted him for 12 years. When they arrived at the address linked to the phone account, the property was small and weathered, hidden behind tall pine trees and a rusted metal gate. A single car sat in the gravel driveway. Bruno let out a low growl as they approached. David felt it too. The unease in the air, the way the forest around them had gone eerily still. He knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. He tried the handle, locked. Just as he turned to head back to the truck, he saw it. A light flickered on inside, briefly, like someone had been watching and made a mistake. David stepped back toward the door. His pulse was racing. Jennifer Palmer was here, and she knew he was too. David stood frozen outside the door, his hand hovering near his holster. Instincts sharpened. Bruno remained at his side, tense but silent, ears perked forward. The flicker of light had been brief, but it was enough. Someone was inside. And David was almost certain it was Jennifer Palmer. 12 years of questions were now separated from him by a single wooden door. He knocked again, this time firmly. Jennifer, it's David Brennan. I'm not here to hurt you. I just need to talk. Silence. Then, after a long pause, the sound of soft footsteps approached the door. The lock clicked once, then again. Slowly, the door opened just a crack. A woman's face appeared, partially shadowed. Her hair was longer, streaked with gray, and her expression was hard, guarded. But there was no mistaking her. David, she said softly, her voice dry, I knew this day would come. He looked at her, searching her eyes. Why did you run? Jennifer exhaled, then stepped back and opened the door fully. Because I was afraid of what I knew, and who might be watching me. Inside, the cabin was small and cluttered. Papers, books, and old photographs covered the table. Among them was a picture David hadn't seen in years, a photo of Michael, Jennifer, and David himself, taken before everything fell apart. It was worn, creased down the middle, like someone had unfolded it too many times. "I didn't kill Michael," Jennifer said suddenly. "But I think I know who did." David's stomach turned. He sat down, trying to keep his voice level. "Start from the beginning." Jennifer sat across from him, her hands trembling. "That night, Michael came to me. He was scared. He said he had gotten involved with someone dangerous. He never gave a name, but he told me if anything happened to him, I should disappear. I didn't believe him. Not until the next day when he was gone." David leaned in, fists clenched. "You left town. You let us believe he abandoned everything. You didn't say a word." "I was trying to stay alive," she snapped. "And I thought if I stayed quiet, Emily would be safe too." The room went silent. David stared at her. "You think whoever was involved? They're watching my daughter now?" Jennifer looked away, then nodded slowly. "I think they never stopped." Outside, the forest wind picked up, rustling the trees. Inside, the silence was suffocating. David knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something far more dangerous than he imagined. David's mind raced as he sat in the dim cabin. The old wooden walls felt like they were closing in. Jennifer stared down at her hands, her knuckles white, as if she was holding back everything she hadn't said for the past 12 years. Outside, Bruno paced restlessly near the window, ears twitching. He sensed the tension too. "You said someone was watching," David said, voice low. "Who?" Jennifer shook her head. "I never learned their name. Michael called them the investors. He said they were tied to something corrupt, something local. He found out by accident. Overheard a conversation, saw documents he wasn't supposed to. After that, he changed. He was scared all the time. And paranoid." David's jaw tightened. "Did he ever mention anyone specific? A company? A sheriff? A deputy?" Jennifer hesitated. "He never said. But I think he suspected someone inside the department. He didn't trust anyone anymore. Not even you." That last sentence hit David harder than he expected. He had always blamed himself for the fight, for the silence that followed. But now he was beginning to understand. Michael hadn't left because of David. He'd run from something else, something he never got the chance to fully reveal. And now, after all these years, it might be circling back to the people David cared about most. "I need to warn Emily," he said, reaching for his phone. Jennifer grabbed his arm. "No, you can't call her. If they're watching you, they'll know. You need to go to her. Quietly. Don't tell anyone you're coming." David hesitated, then slowly nodded. She was right. If there was even a chance Emily was being followed, he couldn't risk alerting anyone. He stood up, adrenaline beginning to surge through his body. This wasn't just about Michael anymore, it was about his daughter. Before he could leave, Jennifer handed him a folded piece of paper. "I don't know if this means anything," she said, "but Michael left it the night he disappeared. I kept it all this time." David unfolded the paper. It was a rough map, hand-drawn. One trail was circled in red, an old mining road near Cedar Ridge. Written next to it, in all caps, "If anything happens to me, start here." David looked at Jennifer, then back at the map. Somehow, even in his final hours, Michael had left a trail. Not for himself, but for the one person he still believed might follow it. And now David would. The wind swept harshly across the open desert road as David Brennan drove south toward Cedar Ridge, the hand-drawn map resting on the seat beside him like a relic from another life. Bruno sat alert in the back seat, eyes fixed out the window, his body tense. The red-circled trail on the map led to a place David hadn't thought about in years. An abandoned mining road, sealed off since a landslide decades ago. It was the kind of place only someone local would remember. David turned off the highway and followed the old dirt path for miles. The further he drove, the more overgrown and narrow the road became, until finally, it ended at a rusted gate buried beneath brush and fallen rock. He parked the truck and got out, tightening his grip on his flashlight and sidearm. Bruno stayed close, ears up, nose twitching. The place felt wrong. Too quiet, too forgotten. They followed the trail by foot, moving carefully through twisted brush and broken terrain. The air was thick with heat and silence, interrupted only by the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. After nearly a mile, they reached what looked like an old service shack, half collapsed but still standing. Faded warning signs clung to its walls. David approached slowly, scanning for movement. Inside, the air was stale. Dust floated in the beams of light filtering through broken boards. David pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. Rusted tools hung on the wall, and in the corner, an old desk sat beneath a thick sheet of grime. Bruno sniffed the floor, growling low. David crossed the room and opened the desk drawer. Inside was a sealed manila envelope with Michael's handwriting on it. To David, only if I'm gone. Hands shaking, David opened the envelope. Inside were several pages of notes, dates, names, locations, and something else, a photograph. It showed Michael standing beside a black SUV. Two men in suits stood behind him, their faces blurred, one with a visible badge clipped to his belt. On the back, Michael had written, "They said they'd ruin us. I think they already started." David sat down, heart pounding. This wasn't just paranoia. Michael had stumbled into something real and dangerous, and someone had wanted him silenced. Suddenly, a noise outside broke the silence. Gravel shifting, footsteps. David stood quickly, gun drawn, motioning for Bruno to stay low. Someone had followed him here, and they weren't far. David froze, listening. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps outside the shack sent a chill up his spine. Bruno stayed low, growling softly, eyes locked on the door. David moved toward the broken window, crouching behind a splintered shelf. He gripped his weapon tightly, heart pounding like a drumbeat in his ears. Whoever had followed him here hadn't come by accident. A shadow passed by the window, then another. At least two people. Trained, quiet. David had been on enough raids to know the signs. These weren't hikers or lost kids. These were men who didn't want to be seen, and they knew exactly where he was. He slowly reached into his pocket and slipped Michael's envelope into his vest, then pointed toward the back of the shack where a collapsed wall might serve as an exit. He and Bruno moved silently, stepping through the debris. The second his boots hit the dirt outside, a voice rang out from behind the building. "Don't move, Deputy Brennan." David turned, raising his hands halfway, still gripping his sidearm. Two men stood in the shadows, both dressed in plain clothes, one wearing a badge clipped to his belt, just like the one in the photo. "You've gone far enough," the man said. "Put the envelope down." David's eyes narrowed. "You're with them, the ones Michael warned about. We're here to protect the integrity of an investigation," the second man said coldly. "Your brother didn't understand what he was involved in. He made a mistake. We gave him a chance to back off. He didn't take it." David's blood boiled. "So you made him disappear?" The man with the badge didn't flinch. "He forced our hand, and now you're making the same mistake." Just then, Bruno lunged. With a sudden growl, the dog launched toward the second man, knocking him off balance. David took the chance and dove behind a pile of rock, gun raised. A shot rang out, hitting the shack's frame inches from his head. He returned fire, grazing the leg of the man who had spoken first. Chaos exploded around them. Shouting, movement, dust kicked up in the moonlight. David grabbed Bruno and ran toward the trail, knowing they couldn't stay. He didn't need to fight these men now. He needed to expose them. He had Michael's files. He had names, dates, proof. But more than that, he had something to lose. Emily. As they fled into the night, David knew one thing with certainty. If they had silenced Michael, they would come for his daughter next. 3 days later, the sun rose quietly over Phoenix, its soft light casting long shadows across the pavement as David Brennan stepped out of the courthouse building, file in hand, exhaustion carved deep into his face. He had spent the last 72 hours locked in meetings with federal agents, handing over every document his brother had left behind. Every photograph, every note, every name. Michael had been telling the truth all along. The envelope had been enough to open a formal investigation. The men who followed David, linked to a private security firm contracted under a false name, were now in custody. But it wasn't justice that David felt. It was something colder, emptier, because even though the truth had finally surfaced, Michael was still gone, and no amount of arrests or reports could bring him back. In a quiet moment, David drove to Emily's apartment. She met him outside with a cautious smile and a tight hug. "I heard," she said. "They showed it on the news this morning. You finally did it." He smiled faintly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "No, we did it. You were part of this, whether you knew it or not." Emily's eyes welled up. "Do you think Uncle Michael ever knew we didn't forget him?" David looked out at the city skyline. "I think that's why he left that trail behind, so one of us would follow it." That afternoon, they returned to Cedar Ridge. At the edge of the canyon where it all began, David buried Michael's backpack, not as evidence but as memory. A small wooden marker stood beside it, carved simply with one word: brother. Bruno sat beside them, ears back, eyes fixed on the horizon. For once, the desert wind was calm. "Sometimes," David said, "we don't get to say goodbye the way we want, but we still get to choose how we remember someone." Emily nodded. He wasn't just a mystery, he was family. They stood in silence, letting the moment settle. In the distance, a hawk soared across the open sky, weightless, unbound, and finally free. As they walked back toward the truck, David felt something shift in his chest. Not closure, not exactly, but peace. A beginning rather than just an end. The darkness that had followed his family for over a decade had finally broken. And for the first time in 12 years, David Brennan didn't feel like he was walking alone.